Talk to me about the beginning of the phytocannabinoid research. The notion that cannabis has these medicinal properties. We knew about it. There were a lot of people who were self-medicating even then, and there were very strict restrictions in relation to the research of it. How has it unfolded now? Was there a particular turning point in the research where we were able to maybe open the door a little bit more? Can you talk a little bit about the origin of some of this, if there was one?
Certainly. So the reality is humans have been using cannabis medicinally, spiritually, recreationally maybe, for all of documented human history, really across every continent. So there's, documentation in Africa, Asia, Europe, the US, from, centuries, if not millennia ago. Now, in the US, I can really speak to that more, and then we tended to influence what happened elsewhere. But in 1937, something called the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. Before that, cannabis or marijuana was in the U.S. pharmacopoeia and actually one of the most, if not the most, prescribed medication in the U.S. And this tax act was passed really due to a lot of political reasons. It was not about safety or efficacy. And to be honest, it was steeped in some pretty ugly cultural and political baggage, having to do with Mexican immigrants at the time. The American Medical Association vigorously opposed that. And even in our congressional library, it says that this act passed in response to the opioid lobby and the competition for pain management space.
Wow, even back in the history.
Yes, back in the history. And I always like to mention that's not my personal conspiracy theory.
No, that's
in the Library of Congress in D.C. And then later on, the Controlled Substances Act passed in 1970. That was equally, if not more, frankly, repulsive in a lot of racism, which made cannabinoids, so these molecules in a cannabis plant, Schedule I, meaning they had no medicinal benefit, even though there had been documented use and people were using them. Anyway, fast forward to the 90s. That's when Dr. Raphael Mechoulam and his team in Israel identified the endocannabinoid system. And it was called that because they had actually previously identified delta-9 THC and CBD and some other cannabinoids. And then they figured out this system in our bodies on which they work. So it's been, quite some time. I believe that was 92. But there was a lot of really interesting research that really started in Israel and is still going on in Israel. They've really been at the forefront of this. But there's been a lot of barriers to research elsewhere, especially in the U.S. We just passed something called the Farm Bill. Originally in 2014, that was a pilot program and a little tricky to interpret. In 2018, it became very clear and permanent. And that means that cannabinoids, if they're derived from hemp, which just means low THC cannabis, are no longer part of the Controlled Substances Act. So that is opening doors for research. There's definitely still barriers, but before then it was really difficult to get a grant for research or approval. You had to have a Schedule I license, and you had to get it through a particular farm in Mississippi.
I heard about this, right? It was at the University of Maryland. Yeah.
With Dr. El Soli, who's brilliant, and that's his farm. But most of it was funded by NIDA, which is the National Institute for Drug Abuse. So it was about abuse and harm as opposed to medicinal use. So that's where the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century had us, and we were in this, just pause in history where prohibition stopped the research. But if you look at the scheme of things, it's actually kind of a blip on the radar.